Awesome, wonderful. I am so glad that you are all here. This is our first ever virtual Nofa Mass Winter Conference. Many of you may have joined us for the Nofa Summer Conference, which was virtual. This is our first virtual winter conference. And we very much hope that we will be able to see you all in person again next year. We do miss seeing all of you in person. But I'm so glad that you've come with us on this journey, and we are so excited you're here for this. So you are attending Exploring the Outer Limits, Post-Soil Testing and Soil Amendments. My name is Cara Roselle, and I'm the Education Director with Nofa Mass, and I'm here with my wonderful colleagues, Laura Davis and our board member, John Duke, who is assisting with hosting today. Laura began her farm, Long Life Farm, with her husband in Hopkinton, Mass, after a successful corporate career, and currently serves 90 CSA members growing on 2.5 acres. She serves as the Nofa Mass board president and also as a technical advisor on our staff, offering lab analysis, soil lab analysis, fertility recommendations. Laura also serves as a technical advisor on our staff, offering lab analysis, fertility recommendations, and providing technical support for farmers working on getting organic certification. Laura serves as an organic inspector as well with Bay State Organic Certifiers and educates regularly with our conferences and at our on-farm events. So I have learned so much from Laura myself over the years, and I'm so excited for what she has to teach us today. But before we jump in, I just have a few details to share with you. So Nofa Mass aims to make our racial equity statement a living document that drives our work. To heal the harm that racism has caused in the food system, we do urge participants to act as allies to BIPOC communities. First, by providing resources to BIPOC organizations that are working to feed their communities. So for instance, making donations or offering your volunteer time. 2, be a partner and stand against white supremacist behavior and actions. 3, work to dismantle racism within the food and agricultural systems. By working together to dismantle racism in the food system, the Commonwealth can truly feed and serve the commonality of us all. So we acknowledge that we are on land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on this map and honor those whose land you now occupy. And I'll be dropping a link to that momentarily, to that map momentarily. We have a number of sponsors who help make our conference possible, and I do encourage you to purchase from them. And when you do, please let them know that you appreciate their support of Nofa Mass. You can find our sponsors in the virtual vendors market, where there are some great discounts and for conference attendees. So please do check them out. And then most importantly, we want to thank you. Thank you for spending the weekend with us, especially to our Nofa members who make our education and advocacy work possible. So I think at this point, Laura, you can start your presentation.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And I'm really excited to see you and a lot of familiar names that I recognize from my previous presentations, as well as people who have been doing soil tests. So welcome, glad you're here. So this title is really kind of, mysterious, but hopefully it's not so mysterious when we're done. I am a farmer, and I am also working at Nofa to do soil technical analysis, and what we learn day to day goes into our recommendations to our members. And so today I just wanted to summarize some of the things that we've learned and things that I'm actually implementing on my farm that will help soil health and give us the better quality crop that we're looking for. So I'm just going to minimize. There we go. Okay, so Long Life Farm is the farm that my husband and I manage in Hopkinton. We farm on leased land that we thank the Nipmuc for originally habitating. Our farm is approximately 1 mile from our home, and we have been on this land since around 2014, but we have another small quarter-acre lot that we've been on since 2011. So we just came upon, or February 11th will be our 10th anniversary with Long Life Farm. As Carol mentioned, I'd spent 30 years in corporate America and only grew in my backyard and our own food. So we have been certified organic since 2013. We've been a no-till operation for the last 4 years. We grow diversified vegetables. Right now we have 90 farm shares, which makes up about 45% of our sales. And we go to 2 farmers markets, which makes up the other 55. We have all of our tunnels are unheated. We don't have any heat. So we have a high tunnel 72 by 32, a small tunnel, which we put up last year, 50 by 14, and we have a seedling house behind our home. We grow anywhere from 30 to 40,000 pounds of produce every year, and I've been utilizing the Albrecht method of mineral balancing since 2011. And our 10-year sales growth, our first year was just over $1,000, and last year we did about $85,000. So we've grown quite a bit in terms of our sales. This is our Long Life Farm crew from last year. And we have 4 full-time people, including my husband and myself. Last year we added one because we felt we stretched ourselves a little bit thin last year because of the pandemic. So many people came to us to ask if they could participate in our share program. So we added a person, and fortunately, they came from the UMass Amherst Food and Agricultural Program, and they were able to get credit while they were working for us on the farm. So it was a win-win. We had 1 part-time person and we had 5 volunteers, and each of those volunteers work 4 hours a week on our harvest days. So the topics that I wanted to cover today are really a reflection of the last 10 years of our farming and what we've learned, and what, if we had to redo, what we would do differently. We're going to really focus on the 3 components of soil, and that is chemical, physical, and the biological components. Those 3 components are all very important. And the universe of testing in these 3 component areas. And then after all of that, you know, post-testing practice and how we are implementing that at our farm. So I spent some time really reflecting over the last 10 years and where we've come with our soils and so forth. And, you know, we really started on very worn out sandy soil, and it's starting to now come alive after all this time. And I wish we had done some things earlier on to make this happen faster. But we'll talk a little bit about that. And so when we started, our organic matter percentages were around 3 to 4%. Now we're between 5.5 and 7.6%. So we've made some modest improvements in the organic matter. And that, I'm sure, will continue at a faster pace now. And I really kind of divide our 10 years up into the point where we were tilling and not tilling, where we were not adding biology and adding biology, and where we were not really doing a good job of using cover crops, and now we're really focused in that area. So those are really some reflections that I believe will help us to get that organic matter growing a lot faster. So our 10-year emphasis was really on the chemical makeup, doing our Albrecht mineral balancing of the soil. When I first started the farm, I had been through the nutrient density course, not once, but twice. Went about 4 years ago to the Kinsey course. So, you know, really the focus was all on chemical. And that's something that I wish we had really focused on the physical and the biology throughout this 10-year period. We didn't have enough focus on the carbon and the biology the last 3 years, until the last 3 years. Our first 6 years, we tilled with a BCS, and the last 4, we've done no-till. The only soil that's really been disturbed is the 10 or 11 beds that we use for potatoes. So now we have an energetic commitment to use of compost and cover crops the last 3 years. And Labor has been critical to bed prep, bed succession, turnover, and foliar spraying. So, if you have a small farm and you're, you're constantly worried about costs and especially with labor being the highest cost that a farm has, it's amazing when you have one extra person like we had last year, how much more you can get done. And the small things, like bed prep and foliar spraying that you can get done with a couple of extra hands. So each new year is a chance to improve our soil health and our food quality. And our continued focus now that we've got our amendments almost where we need them, we're focusing on the biology, on how to enhance photosynthesis with soil and foliar inoculants. But we're keeping an eye on the mineral balance, and we're making a major commitment to cover crop in both ends of the season. So when we first started out, I had attended the nutrient density course, as I mentioned, and this pyramid that's from John Kempf at Advancing Eco Agriculture was presented not in this exact form, but a very rudely drawn one over 10 years ago. And I was so excited to start. I mean, this is the whole reason I started the farm, because I was, came from a background of medical devices where we did clinical trials, proved beneficial outcomes to get FDA approval for a product. And I saw this as an extension of that. How could I, prove to my client base that we had better quality, higher nutritional vegetables, and that would enable me to, sell all my CSA shares and make people want to come to eat our food because we had so much healthier food. And I really believe that after about 6 years, we got to this halfway point up the pyramid, and the most important parts are not the part you can't really read on this slide on where you see all those bugs on the right of the pyramid. The important part is the part over here. So the upper two levels, really how you get there is active immunity, and it's based on vigorous biology. And the bottom part of the pyramid is easier to get to. It's more what they call passive immunity, and it's based on balanced chemistry. That's the chemical part that I think we've got right. Now we're really focused on trying to get to that next level where vigorous biology is really completing the pyramid. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 components of the soil. And the chemical is the first one. Then we'll talk about physical, and then we'll talk about the biological component of soil. And all of the tests that you can utilize to measure your baseline and moving forward, all of these tests are going to enable you to measure your progress. And I think that's really important, especially if you're starting a new garden or a new farm, to have a bench top like this. And so many of you who are attending today have done standard soil tests, so you know what that's like. You know what that's telling you, and that's really telling you that it's the mineral reserves that you have in the soil that might someday be available to the plant. But the mystery here is it really available to the plant? That's the mystery, and that's where our microbes come in. Another test that some of you have done is called the saturated paste test, and that test is really only good for a window in time, but it will tell you exactly what minerals are available today and over the next 2 weeks. So looking at a saturated paste test from last year doesn't do me any good because it really is just telling me what's happening today. Plant sap analysis is another type of chemical test. It's testing the leaves themselves, and it's giving us a result that tells us the actual minerals that were absorbed by that plant. And I just recently listened to John Kempf again on the Acres conference a couple of weeks ago. And after 10 years of his company doing this type of analysis, plant sap analysis, and also standard soil tests, he says there's absolutely no correlation between minerals in the soil in your reserves and the plant sap analysis, which I found to be really, fascinating. And I actually went back to look at mine, and of course they don't correlate. So without the microbes in the soil, those minerals are not going to be available. I think that's the bottom line, but we'll move on and talk about some of these other tests. So the nutritional analysis is another type of test. That's the type of thing that you see on the back of your a label on a food product that you might buy, that says how much proteins and how much of some of the major minerals that are there. And we did some of this testing and are currently doing some of this type of testing and a grant at Nofa, which I'm going to talk about. And then lastly is the Haney test, which I have not done yet. I do plan to do it this year and really learn more about it, but it is sort of the holy grail of learning carbon to nitrogen ratio combined with a microbial measurement. So these are the chemical tests. The first, sorry. Okay. So you definitely want to do these chemical tests. I mean, we don't want to shoot in the dark. And I recommend doing these once a year if you're, just have a smaller garden, maybe once every couple of years, to make sure that your major minerals are where they need to be. We do recommend that you use the Logan Labs test so that if you need our help, we can actually give the recommendation and analysis of your soil from that lab. Many people do like to go through UMass Amherst because it's a pretty simple test. It's using a completely different logic and type of test called the modified Morgan. University of Maine also does that same type of test. But we also like Maine because they give a microbial biomass test that you have an option to check a box for. So if you're using these different labs, you can't compare one to the other. It's like apples and oranges. But many farmers like to do both. They like to do the Logan and they like to do UMass as well because it gives them a different phosphorus level outcome. And that's because of the aggressiveness of one test over the other. But phosphorus is an important nutrient that we don't want to overdo because of the risk of environmental pollution. Okay, so this is an example of a standard soil test. This is mine from this past fall. And I circled the 2 in the middle because that's my biggest field. That's my 2-acre field, and the others are smaller fields. And so this is my most important field. And as I look at this, as I get down to some of the calcium and the magnesium and the potassium, these are our major minerals, and my sulfur and phosphorus. And these are all in pretty good shape. I'm still low on some sulfur and I'm a little bit high on phosphorus now. But, when I don't see any negatives here, I feel like I've got a balance. It's pretty good. My base saturation percentages are pretty good. If you look over here on the left-hand side, these are the numbers that I'm trying to get to. And both of my fields are doing pretty good in terms of my base saturation. And the areas that I'm still working on are boron and manganese, and I have them circled down here. Boron is a synergistic micronutrient that works alongside calcium, and so it's really important to have that in your soil. And manganese is critically important for photosynthesis. And so manganese sulfate is a granular micronutrient that I have actually amended in my soil for the last 10 years, and I've made no progress. And so if you talk to the experts about why that is, John Kemp would tell us that he sees the same thing. To get the most bang for our buck, you really have to foliar spray boron and manganese onto the soil or onto the leaves so that it's more available. So that's one of the things that I'm going to be working on. Okay, and this is the leaf sap analysis that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I'm incorporating this, but this is where you send new and old leaves of a plant in to be tested. They squeeze out the sap and they test the sap to see what nutrients have been absorbed from the soil into the plant. And then there would be a recipe that is prepared specifically for a certain plant that you could utilize. Now, I actually tested, this is beets. I tested beets, cabbage last year because those are my two problem crops. I can't get them to size up the way I want them to. And this particular type of leaf sap analysis is a succession in the same season. So you might do one leaf sap analysis, 2 to 3 weeks after you've planted, and then you get it back. You make a foliar spray recipe, you spray it on, and then a few weeks later, you do another leaf sap analysis. And I haven't actually had to do a third, but that some longer season crops you might do a third test in the season to see how things are progressing. And while I didn't do the leaf sap analysis in 2020, I did it in 2019. I used the same recipe for my beets in 2020, and I was just amazed at the outcome. I had big, juicy beets. I'd never seen them so shiny. The greens were just beautiful. No insect pressure or disease. And so I'm really sold on this. It's not the sort of thing that you want to do on the whole, garden or the whole farm, but where you're having specific issues, I think it really does uncover a lot of mysteries about what is really going on. If you look at this particular test, if you look at the calcium here, it's showing very, very low, but on my standard soil test, it says I got plenty of calcium. And so, this is really what the plant is taking up. And there's also sorts of mysteries around why it's taking up certain things and not others. But this is, I think, a better view into what is happening in the plant. Okay. So I mentioned nutritional analysis of crop. The Bionutrient Food Association is working on a fairly comprehensive program. Nofa is involved with a certain program this year through an MDAR grant. We're working with the BFA and our SCI on a spinach and carrot study, whereby we're taking leaves from spinach and actually carrots. We're taking the soil nearby where we took the leaves or the carrot from, and both soil and veg are going in twice a year, spring and fall, into the lab, and it's a 3-year study. We're also tracking the practices that are going into each farm that are participating. So whether they're tilling or not, are they broad forking? Is compost being used? What type of fertilizers are they used by name and brand? Cover crops, what type? Are they organic or not? Are they using foliar spray or not? And we'll be going into our 3rd year this year. And this is not all of the results from my spinach, but it is being compared with our USDA averages. And I'm happy to report that, on some of the major minerals, magnesium and calcium especially, my spinach is a whole lot better than what you can buy in the grocery store. And this program is so exciting too, because it's testing things like phytonutrients, and it's this data is not only exciting for me to show my CSA customers and my customers at the farmers market, but also this information is going into the development of a device that consumers can use to measure nutrition testing. So I'm really excited about that potential.
Laura, before you move on to the next test, we have had some questions come in.
Yes.
So there were a couple questions about best place to get Sap analysis done. So I had been sharing some links to soil labs, but I actually don't know what to recommend for Sap analysis.
So this particular Sap analysis is through Advancing Eco Agriculture. I know it doesn't say that, but they send it to the Netherlands for the leaf sap analysis.
Okay.
And before you start to do this at the beginning of the season, before things get busy, you would actually talk to Advancing Eco Agriculture, and they send you out the sample bags, the instructions, and they're all labeled with which plant, which field you're going to be sending in that year. So it takes a little bit of planning to get this put in place before you start pulling your leaves and sending them in. There are other leaf sap testing analysis. A lot of the major agricultural labs do this. I do believe that University of Maine does it. I have to check back at UMass Amherst. They used to do it before the pandemic, before they shut down, but I don't know about their current status.
Got it. Another question has come in that actually I can answer. Yoko and Alex, can farmers get this MDAR test done? So this is an MDAR funded grant, but the tests that we're actually doing that Laura was just describing with the nutrient comparison is through the Real Food Campaign. So I know you know folks over there. So there is a way to sign up as a farm partner, and I can look up those links and drop them in the chat momentarily, but you can sign up as a farm partner to submit soil and crop samples to the Real Food Campaign, and they have a lab that they've set up. And if you contact me separately, Yoko, I'd be happy to add your data into our comparisons to USDA data. That's not something that they offer, that's something that I do, but I'd be happy to do that for you. So we can connect about that separately. And Laura, yeah, any comments about that?
Yeah, I think that what's really amazing is that these results look really amazing at my farm, but I'm not the best on the list of the 12 farms. I'll have to admit, but all of the farms that are participating, I think we have 12, right? 12 farms? 10, okay. They're all, you know, Nofa members, and they're all, you know, working on soil fertility. So depending upon how long they've been working, like somebody like Julie Rawson, who's been working, you know, 35 years on her soil, she has really good numbers. So it's something to work towards.
Yeah, I think our highest farm in that group in terms of comparison to USDA averages has been in no-till for like 10 years. So yeah. One more question. Have you done any research on scale resonance and the formation of protein and growth by the plants? And if so, can you share music sources for specific plants? So I guess this has to do with playing music for plants.
I have not, but it sounds intriguing.
Yes, great. All right, I think that is what we have so far.
Okay. Thank you.
For questions.
Okay, so I mentioned the Haney test. Rick Haney is the person who this test is named after, and he actually developed an extract which mimics the organic acids that's produced by living plant roots, so that's within the rhizosphere. And that particular test combines the balance of soil carbon and nitrogen and the relationship to the microbial activity in that rhizosphere. And so as I mentioned, I'm going to do this test this year and see, you know, what it can tell me about the carbon in my soil. And so stay tuned to that. I don't know if anybody in the audience has done a Haney test thus far, but if you have, maybe you can just tell us in the chat. So now I'm going to move on to the second component, which is the physical component of soil. And this is really an area that Caro has been really instrumental in helping Nofa put these carbon proxy tests together for a fully, self-administered test by a gardener or a farmer, or if the farmer wants Nofa to come out and do the entire battery of tests. Caro and our soil tech team have done a number of these throughout Massachusetts. And any of you who attended some of our workshops over the last couple of years, where we talked about these particular tests, and we actually demonstrated some of these tests, you'll recognize some of them. And I would urge you all to do these, and then do them either every year or every other year, and to measure the difference in some of these tests on your soil. So I'll just go to that proxy test right now. This is on the website that you can access, and it's really a DIY. And I'm going to go through each of these tests on my slides, but I just want to show you what it looks like. Here's test number 1, and it gives you the ability to make notes and put the dates, and then you can redo these next year and go from there. So it's a really good way to measure these physical characteristics of your soil. And if you're a farm and you want Nofa to do it, we do these complete 7 battery of tests on your farm. So what these do is the Nofa carbon proxy tests observe the soil as an ecosystem and directly measure the aspects of soil biology that are proxies for the presence of carbon. Such tests are inexpensive, can be done on the farm, and can give immediate results. As a part of its soil carbon program, Nofa Mass has developed such tests over the past 5 years. So Carol, you can put the link of those of that form or the booklet on the chat. But these are what the tests are actually showing us and correlating to our soil health. So the surface biology, looking at how much of the soil is covered in plants. If there's more diversity of plants and less bare ground, it's going to correlate to soil health. How many earthworms do you have in a square foot of soil? An increase from count to count, year to year, is going to indicate an improving soil health. I mean, these things may sound obvious, but when you track them and you can actually tell for your particular growing area how you're improving, these are great ways to measure that. So digging a hole and assessing the aggregates and the structure, more aggregation and less compaction is a correlation to soil health. The water infiltration is really telling. This test in particular is easy to replicate on your growing area. We're measuring for a minute how much water infiltrates the soil, and better infiltration means you've got pores and aggregates, and that there's more carbon and water holding capacity in your soil. The Slag Test is where a aggregate is actually put into a basket of a jar of water. And usually when Caro does this type of test, it's on a field type of soil, and something that may be no-till, like in the forest, and showing how your soil could be prone to erosion, and how those aggregates can hold together. So these first 5 tests within that booklet are pretty easy to do within your own farm and growing area. The next 2, actually, the active carbon test and the respiration test, a little bit more, you need a few more tools to do these, but those certainly are not impossible to do. These, the active carbon test can indicate soil health response of ag practices prior to evidence in an organic matter test. And so I think that's an important correlation to soil health. The respiration test measures the CO2 exhaled by microbes from year to year, is a good proxy for increases in soil carbon. This measures the microbial activity and highly reliable indicator of soil health. And Solvita is the name of that type of test.
Laura, since you invited me to interject earlier, I just want to make a couple comments. One is, the respiration test from Solvita, you can buy a kit for that. Just after using it for a few years, my recommendation is that if you're not doing it in a lab environment in which you can hold the test at a steady 70 degrees and do a 4-day version of the test, just based on reading tech recommendations about this from NRCS, the best way to use that test is actually to run 2 tests doing a comparison. So like Laura mentioned earlier, compare your forest soil or your pasture or your garden or some kind of undisturbed soil, something under maybe an established perennial area, and then compare that with your vegetable growing area, just to sort of see what the difference in respiration is. Also, just don't take that test right after you've tilled, because that can be give you a false kind of burst of CO2. And then I dropped a link for where you can get an active carbon kit from Soil One, and folks can email me if they have any questions about how to run that test. And then there was one question from Myrna about whether it's worth doing these physical field tests in raised beds. And I would say absolutely, especially the infiltration test and some of the compaction tests, because with raised beds, typically what you'll have is a lot lighter soil at the surface and much harder soil below. And it can be helpful to know at what point you have harder soil and how to kind of loosen that and integrate those layers a little bit. And infiltration can be really important for raised bed soils because sometimes very high organic matter layer at the top of your soil can result in hydrophobia. And if that's happening, you might want to consider adding some rock dust or more geologically natural soil from your forest or something to help reduce that tendency toward hydrophobia. So those are just a couple comments since you invited me to do that, Laura, and answer that question.
Thanks, Carol. That's great. So I'm going to move on to the third component of soil, which is the biological. And really, this is an area that is, growing in knowledge, growing in understanding the importance of the biology and why it's important for the biology to be there, because all the minerals in the world and all the mineral balancing in the world is not going to help if the little farmers under the soil are not there to help make them available. So I thought we'd talk about the biological next, and there's a lot of great resources out in the world about biology, and it really is becoming a way for us to bring biology in, because most of all of our soils have been beaten up by weather and agricultural practices and mistreated in various ways. And our biology will return, but we want to hurry it along and enter in some of that biology that may not be there currently. So a couple of tests that can be used is the microbial biomass. I mentioned University of Maine, but there are other ones. Solvita we talked about. This is a new kit that John and I have talked about a bit, called the Micro Biometer, and it's fairly inexpensive that you can do it at home, and it will test the microbes in your soil. And so I'm going to be experimenting with this as well to, compare it to the some of the other tests that we're going to be doing. But that really could be a very quick way to work through and get your own tests and start with, your own way of doing this instead of, it could be a lot less expensive than sending it in for a test in a lab. Okay. The last biological tests, and by no means the least, but John, our other Zoom host here, our board member, has been through the Elaine Ingham Soil Food Web course, and she offers a way for people to learn how to identify the microorganisms in their soil, and everything from bacteria to fungi to nematodes, etc. And then how to increase their numbers in your compost and your compost teas. And John, just jump in at any time if you'd like to share your thoughts about the course itself.
The course is excellent. I will real quick, Laura. The course is excellent. It takes quite a bit of time for sure. It does provide you a tool though, because you learn to use a microscope and identify, particular microbes, which happen to be aerobic microbes, to help facilitate all this mineral balancing that Laura's talking about. It certainly takes time, and it's not the cheapest course around. But if you can get it from our auction today for under $5,000, it would be a steal. So you want to check that out because we are offering it in our auction. So it's well worth it. And it provides you, the tool to really get familiar with these microbes. The course itself it'll open up your eyes to a whole other world that, we didn't even know was out there.
That's right. And a generous donor has enabled us to offer this on the auction. It's a $5,000 value, and the first bid is $1,500. So any of you who are really committed to moving in this direction, I would urge you to take advantage before 5 p.m. tomorrow. Okay. So that is the third component. I want to go through some of these. So what does it mean when you get your test back? This is the result and the gauge from the University of Maine, which I have utilized for my own. They will give you a measurement of your microbial biomass interpretation, which is parts per million of CO2C. And also this includes the recommendations depending upon which level you're at. So if it comes back and you have low biomass, they recommend that you are using, green manures in terms of your cover crops, that you are adding up to 2 inches of compost each year. And this will substantially improve the soil organic matter content and quality. If you have medium biomass, 1 inch of compost per year, and of course, continue with your cover crop as well. And then if you have a measurement between 140 and 300, you have very high biomass and you have a very strong microbial population. And so you have a lower maintenance of compost. If you're doing succession planting bed after bed, you're going to need to, add some of that between crops. But that really is a good measurement of how you're doing in terms of your biology. So it's a really good measurement for you to track.
Laura, can I just jump in real quick?
Sure.
So the one thing that I will say, not all compost is the same. So when you take a recommendation like that, you still need to consider what is the biological quality of the compost that I'm applying, because not all compost is the same. Some of it is putrefied waste and it can be detrimental. So, and that's probably a whole other workshop in itself, but just keep that in the back of your mind.
That's right. Thank you. We talked a little bit about Solvita. This is going to give you a similar measurement. The Micro Biometer is going to give you that type of a measurement as well. And the Soil Food Web that many of you recognize the start, this is from Elaine Ingham. These are all of the microorganisms that are working in the soil and above the soil. And we talked a little bit about the course. This is a great way to bring your soil back to life, but also to create the right biology, as John mentioned, in your compost and the tea. I'm looking forward to testing some compost myself to give this a go and hopefully get some instruction from John on the microscope and what I'm really looking for. So that's how we test and how we measure our progress of moving to a biological system. And so before I move on to what we do at our farm, I just wanted to see if there's any more questions.
There is. Christy is wondering, for the home gardener who may not be able to utilize more costly tests, which evaluations would you prioritize?
Okay, so I would definitely do a soil test at least every other year in a garden, and balance your minerals as best you can. That has to be a first step. And then I think biological applications like seed inoculant, putting an inoculant in your transplant water, and possibly even doing a foliar spray here and there could really be a great way to do things. I would also test specifically, how many worms you have using that particular test, and using cover crops, all of these things. And I think that this question will also be answered as you see what I'm doing to ensure I'm adding biology, adding organic matter, and so forth.
And Christy, I know at the summer conference, you were having some problems with germination. So I would really recommend the infiltration test. If you can find a way to make a cylinder for yourself out of sewer pipe, just kind of cut it off, sharpen one end, pound it into the soil. The manual contains that protocol. I think that will help you identify if part of your issue with germination might be hydrophobia because of high organic matter in your garden. One more question, sorry, Laura. Are there any commercially available composts that have been tested that you'd specifically recommend? Ellen says that she's used horse compost and don't know its value, but don't see a great organic benefit. So like cow, horse, any commercial products that you recommend?
Well, that's a great question. I have not actually done the compost test on them myself, but it's something that John and I have been talking about. We would like to test all of the nearby available compost to see what we got. But we have not done that yet. Most of these compost companies do enable you, they do test it, and they can give you a compost soil test to look at. But I don't know that those tests actually give you any microbial count. I'm sure they don't. So
right.
The only thing I can say is that producing compost for for organic farm use is something that Bay State will inspect and approve for us to use. But again, we're not talking about the best compost in terms of biology when we look at those measurements and those approvals.
Ellen, if you drop your location in the chat, I can let you know if there's any compost producers that Nofa is really aware of and works with that are close to you. Yeah. One more question. So I've had a little back and forth with Patrick in the chat about texture, soil texture. And I've given some thoughts, but I wonder what your thoughts are between the relationship between the UMass soil texture testing, so particle size distribution, and the Nofa test suite. Is the texture testing a good starting point, or can it be helpful in better understanding Nofa testing?
I am not familiar with the UMass texture test, but I think that the Nofa test is a really good one. And it outlines specifically how to hold it, how to squeeze it, and what it's telling you. So I think I would definitely try that DIY test on the Nofa carbon proxy test. Okay. All right, so what are we doing in terms of practical application of everything here that we've talked about? So if I look at, using the test results to improve soil fertility and to track improvements from year to year. Just to review the chemical tests, we're doing amendments to address deficiencies to build up our reserves. We are specifically looking at foliar sprays to address trace element deficiency in crops. Because the dry micronutrients that I've been applying have not changed have not moved the needle that much. And this is something that, you know, John Kempf readily says that dry micronutrients, while they can help build up the soil, but you have to have a lot of biology there to make them active. Foliar sprays give you more bang for your buck when you're looking at trying to impact something like manganese and boron, which are two very important ones. Foliar sprays also can enhance photosynthesis. And so the reason that's important is because the plant needs a certain amount of these sugars and carbohydrates for the plant and the fruit. But what you want is for them to be pushing some of that down into the root zone. So the more they have, the more they can utilize, and then any extras they can push into the root zone for the microbial life to live on. The physical piece of the soil, you know, we're going to continue to increase our organic matter. It definitely helps. It will increase the total exchange capacity, which is the soil's ability to hold on to the minerals, and will increase the soil structure. So if you have if you're starting out in a garden or a farm and you have compaction, you need to address that first before you really start out. You know, you don't want to start with compacted soils because you don't have air, you don't have any microbial activity in there. So it's really important if you're starting out to address that right off the bat, because you'll continue to battle with it for years on. You're going to want to focus on cover crops early. In my particular situation, I knew it was important. I knew it was required for organic certification, and I just seemed to never get around to it. And my first 4 or 5 years, it was always an afterthought. And so if it's not part of your plan, it's not going to get done. And it's really, really critical. And this was a key takeaway from the MDAR tests that we did. And we didn't put those up yet, Carol. But maybe you want to talk to what the key benefit was that we saw on those 6 farms from cover cropping.
Oh yeah, and it's been a while since I've looked at that, but I'll put that report in the chat momentarily. But yeah, I think that what we saw was that, and again, this is just 6 farms, so it's not statistically significant, but we did kind of look at, you know, infiltration rates and different soil health outcomes against different management practices. And we did find that the farms that had cover cropped within the past year had the fastest infiltration rates. So that seemed to be the indicator that was most strongly correlated with the faster infiltration rate. However, of course, we weren't controlling for other things that those farms were doing, like mulching and things like that. But when we looked at all those different factors against the infiltration rates, cover cropping had the highest correlation. So I'll drop a link to that report in the chat so you can check it out. But just, you know, with the caveat that it was just 6 farms and we didn't control anything.
Right. Thanks. So you also want to keep your soil covered in diversity of plants. Mulch if you don't have any plant cover. So straw, hay, leaves, even weed guard, just something that's going to keep it covered. You want to avoid soil disturbance. And I have found the most dramatic improvement since I have not tilled in 4 years. I wish on these tired sandy soils that I started with, I wish I had known back when I started 10 years ago. But the biology, we really do need to restore the bacteria and fungi to increase the nutrient cycling. Most soils don't have what they need. So using an inoculant with mycorrhiza fungi on the seed, in the soil, in the drench is really critical. The mycorrhiza fungi are your roots extensions. They bring in water, nutrients, microbes, it's really critical that they are there. And you can also inoculate your soils with, beneficial bacterias. There's quite a few on the Nofa bulk order, from Spectrum to EM1 to Micro 5000. These are all have a broad spectrum of beneficial bacteria that our soils need, that most of our soils don't have. Make sure they have food when you put these guys in, which means that, some liquid kelp or some fish or some rejuvenate or sea shield, any of those things that you mix with the bacteria and water as you apply it. And compost without manure if your phosphorus is high. And vermicompost. We have some vermicompost on the bulk order this year also, which I'm going to use for the first time. And important to microbes is also moisture. So you can't let your soil dry out. You need to keep it moist, and they aren't happy, and they will go dormant if they don't have the right moisture. So I mentioned a couple of these seed inoculants. Sorry, that seed inoculant is not Spectrum, but is Micro Coat Gold is one. Micro Apply is another one. And a pea and bean inoculant is specific to legumes, which is very useful. Again, compost, really need non-manure based if your phosphorus is high. Vermicompost, which is the worm compost, and a soil inoculant, which I mentioned. Natural mulches are really important. Leaves, hay, straw, March hay, cover crops, spring and fall. And I'm going to talk about how I incorporate both. Foliar spray on leaves or on the soil, and foliar spray to address problems with micronutrient deficiencies. Okay, so spring bed prep for summer plants. This is when I'm talking about mid-March to mid-April. And we're actually seeding peas and oats on beds that are either bare, we didn't get them cover cropped, or they had mulch on them, like hay or leaves. And these are plants that are not going to be planted until Memorial Day. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, winter squash, all get treated this way. So that cover crop, if you get it in like mid to late March, is going to grow for approximately 2 months and keep those weeds away and actually feed the microorganisms under the soil while you are waiting to get these summer plants planted. Now, originally I was broadcasting with one of these red over-the-shoulder seed distributors. But what happens if you have a dry spring is they don't germinate, and then you wasted all of that money. So I've moved on to using the Earthway seeder to seed the cover crop directly on the bed. And I'll show you what that looks like. We mow that cover crop on the top of the bed anywhere from 1 week to 2 weeks before we plant, sometimes the same day if we're late. We broad fork the bed and we compost. We've been putting about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of compost on top of the bed. We're using a pre-transplant that is a 4-gallon watering bucket that is filled almost to the top with water. And then we add a cup each of Rejuvenate and Sea Shield and 1/8 of a teaspoon of Spectrum, which is the beneficial bacteria. We put our drip tape down, and then we mulch around the plants, the tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants, the winter squash, and the cucumbers. And it's usually hay. And then we're putting a black weed guard in the pathways. And that is our summer plant process. This is what on the picture on the left is what it looks like if you broadcast and you're lucky enough to have enough rain. Maybe I raked it in to make sure that I had soil contact. It's a really good display, but more often than not, I don't have enough moisture and the cover crop gets wasted. The birds eat it and it doesn't look this great, but in the last couple of years, I've switched to using my earthway seeder. This is what it looks like after a couple of weeks in the middle picture, and this is what it looks like after a month or more on the far right. And it's such, I'm using a lot less cover crop seed. I'm not actually doing my pathways, but I'm just using my cover crop peas and oats in the bed itself. And this is what it looks like after the plants are in and the cover crop or the Hopkinton Pro weed guard is in the pathway. So on the left, that's our field edge. And this is peppers that have been planted and mulched with hay, and then the weed guards in the walkway. On the right is our tomatoes. You can see the stakes are there. We haven't started tying yet, but that is the treatment that we use for all of these plants. And what's really great on the second succession, let's just talk and pretend that the picture on the right is our winter squash or our summer squash. What's great about this is that after that plant's done, all we have to do is rake off the hay into the walking path and plant our second succession. And there's no weeds there, and we just have to worry about whether we're going to broad fork, put more compost down, and then plant directly into the bed. So the spring bed prep for April planting, which is different than what I just described. Most of these beds, if they had cover crop, it's dead because it's winter killed. Some of these beds may have had shredded leaves on them, and we will actually rake those off the bed into the pathway. We'll broad fork, we'll compost, we'll use a bed rake to smooth it out, and then we'll direct seed into that bed, carrots, salad mix, any of those types of spring crops. And we use the exact same transplant drench that I described before on that bed. We water it in, we put our drip tape down, and we will row cover it. If it's carrots or lettuce mix, the row cover goes right on the bed without poles. And if it's transplants, they get poles and row cover. And then we put the weed guard in the walkway. This is an example of the onions that got transplanted in mid to late April. And for succession planting, once, let's say, summer squash is done, or once that first bed of carrots is done, we remove the plant material from the bed. We broad fork if necessary. We compost. I call it a 1/4 inch, but what this is on a 100-foot bed, 3 feet wide, is approximately 10 7-gallon tub truck buckets full of compost throughout the entire bed. And we seed or transplant our next crop, and we use again the same rejuvenated sea shield and spectrum. So we're adding in more biology at every planting, and we're not some of our beds have been used up to 3 times during the season, but many of them, like tomatoes, eggplants, they're really just used once. Okay, so foliar feeding, and where does this come in? Ideally, general foliar feeding with a liquid kelp every 2 weeks to include my deficiencies, which are boron and manganese. This would be ideal, but the bottom line is it seems like unless I have enough labor, this is something that always falls to the wayside because we're so busy doing other things. But last year I found that we were able to do this more, and because I had 1 extra person, and it really did help a lot. I'm really still going to focus on foliar feeding for my problem crops. The beets and cabbage are my main problem crops. I just have had trouble with them sizing up. So I am going to do the Sap analysis test on these particular crops to make sure that I can give them the right nutrients that they're going to need to make them successful. And so this particular for beets specifically was boron, iron, and phosphorus that was applied with a either kelp or some of the other AEA products. And again, that's what this leaf sap analysis is going to tell us that it needed. So what do we do before winter? Mid-August to mid-September, we're going to seed cover crops directly onto the beds with the seeder. The beds that had crops late into October get covered with leaves or straw or hay. Late October and November, for the last 2 years, we have done this fall primer that's sprayed on all the beds, and it's the exact same recipe that we use for every planting and transplant, the Sea Shield, the Rejuvenate, and the Spectrum. This year, we sprayed it on all of the leaves if we had leaves on the bed. We sprayed it on all of the green cover crop that was growing. And if there was plants still in the field, like Brussels sprouts and kale, we sprayed underneath those plants onto the soil directly. And then this was the recipe, Rejuvenate, Sea Shield, Beneficial Microbes. And this particular recipe is from AEA. John Kemp talks about it in a video, which I should have copied here. But he compared a couple of his farms, a farm that did cover cropping and a farm that did no cover cropping, but used the fall primer. He found the soil microbial life more active and alive in that one than he did on the other one with the cover crop. And so he said, bottom line is spray the fall primer on your cover crop and you're going to have, double the bonus. And it really just keeps the microbial life happy over the winter. And I'm definitely noticing a difference in the spring. This is just a picture of the field mulch with shredded leaves. Just one more thought about that point about what John tells us is that this particular fall primer enables those microbes to continue cycling nutrients so that they're available in the spring. And I did find that to be the case. So even though this seems like a lot to do at the end of the year, our last crew day, we had 5 people, everybody had a backpack sprayer, and we got it done in 2 hours on our 2.5 acres. So it wasn't a huge amount of work. And I really do believe that it's very helpful for our soils. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
That was fantastic, Laura. So we do have a few questions that have come in. Folks can keep putting them in the chat, but if we have time after you've answered these questions, people might want to be able to come off mute to ask some questions. So there were a couple questions about your water, Rejuvenate, Sea Shield, and Spectrum mix. So you mentioned 4 gallons. How much area does that cover?
That is going on a one bed, which is 100 by 3 feet, so 300 square feet.
Great.
So we're not really trying to saturate the bed soil with this moisture. We're really trying to apply microbes throughout the whole 300 square feet. We're not worried about, we want it to be wet afterwards, but the main point is to spread those microbials and the food that's in the Rejuvenate and Sea Shield throughout the whole bed.
Okay. And you may have already answered this, but just to confirm, are you applying that mixture on a bed that's just been direct sown?
Yes.
Okay. And then another question about sort of spraying generally. Have you found a backpack sprayer that doesn't get easily clogged? This person, Maureen, has been using Solo, but they clog so easily.
I think we're on our 12th backpack sprayer. We just bought 4 more this past year, so everybody could have one. You definitely have to clean it well when you get done each time. That's the key. Most of these nutrients, the 3 I mentioned, the Rejuvenate, Sea Shield, and the Spectrum, don't clog as easily as some of the other amendments I've used in there. So, but you definitely do need to clean it well, the whole hose, and don't leave it overnight because that's, it's almost done if it dries up in there.
I'm just curious, are there component parts that tend to get clogged that you can buy kind of a backup stash of so you don't have to replace the whole sprayer, or is it
The nozzle, yeah, the nozzle. Yeah, we have a couple. We actually take all the old ones apart and sort of save those things, but it's sort of a trial and error which ones you need to replace, and it's a bit of a pain, but I find that it's what an $80 backpack sprayer. It's and we have one on the Nofa bulk order this year, so you can. I think it's the solo one.
Yoko and Alex have been using a watering can. They're wondering, do you use a backpack sprayer for a more even application or for efficiency or what?
We use a watering can when we're planting. So we're using the watering can to cover the 300 square foot bed when we're transplanting or direct seeding. And we're using the backpack sprayer when we're doing the fall primer or the foliar spray for our beets and the cabbage. And, if we have time to do foliar spraying every 2 weeks, it's with the kelp, liquid kelp and the micronutrients. And I would also put the biology in there as well. But no, we're using the watering bucket mostly throughout when we're planting.
Great. There was a question about the peas and oats mix. I think you're mostly doing that winter kill, but if you're doing it in the spring, how are you terminating that?
So we are just mowing it, and well, in the spring it's dead and we're just raking it off the bed. When we're planting it new in the spring, we're letting it grow for about a month and a half to 2 months. We're mowing it and we're planting directly into it. And then it's being mulched with straw or hay. And what I find is that you might get a couple peas or oats growing up through the hay or straw, but by and large, it's not all growing back. Especially after it's mowed, we're putting compost down and then we're mulching it.
Great. There was a question earlier about compost that I missed also from Yoko and Alex. So they have looked at a number of compost analyses and understand what CN ratio to look for. But is there a good resource for guidelines and how to understand how much pounds per acre, for example, of phosphorus and potassium you're applying per inch of compost?
That's a really great question. And it's something that I think we need to work on, Carol, in putting together and testing our compost. I'm saying we, Nofa, our soil tech team, I would love to work on that specifically. I know that the Vermont Compost Company has a lot of resources on their website about the compost. But certainly if you have a test from the company that is supplying the compost with the phosphorus and everything else, then we could calculate how much you should apply, comparing that to your soil test.
Yeah, it does. It is coming up a couple times in this conversation, and it makes me think that maybe we should be looking for some funding to do that evaluation and create those resources. One thing I'll say about that is that before I buy compost, I always go to the website of the compost provider and look at their most recent analysis. If it's a good compost company, they'll provide on their website the most recent analysis that they've gotten done of their compost. It's not always from the same batch, but it should represent sort of that year's, feedstocks and methods. I know that, some of the compost companies we work closely with at Nofa are Ideal Compost and Black Earth Compost, and Earth Care Farm and Vermont Compost Company, and all of those companies do provide that information on their website. So you can usually extrapolate from that.
Yeah, I'm using a vegetative compost from Western Nurseries because they've been approved by Bay State Organic for my use since I'm certified. This past year, I decided I needed more biology, so I got some compost from my friend farmer from the pumpkin farm in Medway. They raise animals, so their compost is manure based. So I did use that this past year. It made a huge amount of difference. but I won't use it every year because I've already got my phosphorus levels pretty high.
Maureen is wondering, is it true that if your compost freezes over the winter that it might not be as effective or even beneficial anymore?
Those microbes come back. They adjust to the environment, and they go dormant. They come back. Sometimes you might have to add more microbes of different types and numbers, but they're very adaptable to your environment. John?
Yeah, they're actually, the microbial community can be more active underneath snow during the winter more than any other time in the year. A lot of these microbes, particularly the fungal component, they've done tests, NASA's done tests, they've taken these spores to space, put them out into the vacuums of space, brought them back in, brought them back down to Earth, and they still sporulated. So they're gonna they might cyst up, and they're not gonna be active if they're frozen solid. More importantly is the moisture content. They need moisture and air. The good ones, the beneficial ones, the aerobic ones, need moisture and air to be active. So just keep that in your mind, but they're far more durable than we are.
Yeah. If by some chance you're still sitting on your Logan Lab soil test report and you want to get that analyzed, you can still send that in. We're going to try and work as fast as we can to get you a recommendation before the bulk order closes. But just know that if you haven't already sent yours in for analysis, there's still time to do so.
What about bagged compost? Just the same question from before. If you leave it in a bag, are you kind of is there compost quality declining while it's frozen?
Sometimes I question that plastic bag, but I've talked to Vermont Compost about this. Their bags breathe, and I leave a whole pallet out on my driveway during the winter and the summer. They don't like it to be heated up, but they don't care if it's frozen. And again, it still feels active. My plants are very rigorous. I have had bags where I've held them over 2 years, and it definitely has made a difference in terms of less vitality to my plants. But those are bags that breathe, and I'm not so sure about those plastic bags like you see. And I know that Maine Coast makes a really good product, but it's all in plastic, and I would definitely want to see that opened up and used.
Great.
If it smells bad, it's probably bad. If you're buying anything, I think a good way to, if you're wondering, the biological component, if you ask the manufacturers, the producers of this compost, what the fungal to bacteria ratio is, and if they look at you cross-eyed, then they're not considering the biological component of the compost. So you might want to not purchase their product. If they tell you what the fungal to bacteria ratio is, then they've done the analysis. They understand the biological input of the compost. And then if you smell it and hold it and feel it, use those senses to your advantage, because we all have them, and they're useful. If they have the biological analysis, if they've got a test from a soil food web lab or something like that, that's a great indicator as well.
That's great. Thanks, John. So in the last few minutes here, I've seen a question come in from Yoko and Alex and from Christy. I wonder if you two would just like to, we have time, if you'd like to just come off of mute and ask your questions directly, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I'll ask them for you.
Hello, this is Yoko. Sorry, I have a lot of questions.
No, it's great. Thanks for asking such great questions.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Laura. It's been a really helpful workshop so far. So my latest question on the comment was, so some farmers think of compost as mulch and they don't protect that, compost, and others think they need to be protected with hay straw, wood chips or leaves. What do you think of that?
Well, I do think that the compost, I'm not as protective of my compost, I think, as some, because of the amount of time it takes us to prep a bed anyway. And our compost is open to the air when we're direct seeding.
Yeah.
You know, we rake it in a little bit with the bed rake, but then we direct seed and nothing else is going on there. So my main focus is to try and keep it moist, but I don't cover it up with other mulches. I guess it would be protected, but the summer plants, all that compost is underneath the mulch.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Laura. Thank you very much for all of your
Hi, Christine.
advice. I really appreciate it. I was wondering, because again, my focus is often on the small home garden because I'm not a farmer. I have a small kitchen garden and I teach classes on that. I want to be able to give good advice to my students about all these various aspects, and sometimes have to modify the advice when we're working on a really small scale. So in particular, I have my own home compost pile. And in the last few years, I had a lot of questions myself about the nature of my own compost. Mine is formed of household kitchen wastes. I never put meat or fats or things like that into my compost. But, you know, eggshells, coffee grounds, vegetable tops, those kinds of things. I add to that for carbon material that I like, the dead stalks of perennial flowering plants, things like that, that I can harvest from my own yard. Undiseased or uninsect infected vegetable that I take out of my garden goes into it. I never put seedy weeds or weeds that are apt to proliferate from roots that might not break down. Those never go in there, but that's the basis of my home compost. I know that you can get compost tested. I've never done that, and one reason is that it just seems like compost as such a living organism. I wonder if a test is going to be accurate if I send it in and then I get it back and, you know, my compost has modified in some ways since the test went in. So I'm wondering, do you recommend getting compost tested? And if not, what do you recommend that the home gardener do to evaluate the compost you make yourself?
Well, there's a couple of different things in there. When you start out making compost, you want to make sure that the carbon to nitrogen ratio is between 25
Right.
and 40 to 1. And
Right.
there are some calculators online that you can use to calculate that. So you can tell it, the calculator, I'm using 2 huge buckets of leaves. I'm using, you know, 2 huge buckets of green grass. I'm using, you know, so you can put those in there and it'll tell you what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is when you start. And if you start that way, that's the best thing to do. But in terms of testing compost, if you are going to buy compost for your garden or your farm, it would be really important to see that test that the manufacturer does or to test it yourself. Now, there's a couple different things that's going to test. It's going to test the soil to the carbon to nitrogen ratio when it's finished to make sure it's finished compost. Is it completely broken down? And then the other thing it's not going to test that John was talking about is the microbial benefit of that compost. I don't think I've seen any compost tests, commercial compost tests that have showed us that data. So that's one of the things that I would be great for us to do at Nofa is to look at that and test some of them. But it would be worth it specifically for if you're going to use it on a customer's, a client's beds to get it tested.
Great question. Any other final questions from folks? We can fit one more in. All right. Well, I've been putting some links in the chat as we close out here. Thank you all so much for being here. And Laura, thank you so much for your excellent information. That was
Thank you.
fantastic.
I appreciate everybody being here, and it's nice to see so many names of people who have been to my other chemistry calculation classes.
Yeah, you know you're doing something right when we get this many great repeat folks. I've seen a lot of the same folks here who've come to your previous workshops. So if you're wondering about how to save a copy of the chat for all these great references, I did put some instructions in the chat, but just briefly, you can click the three little dots next to where you type your messages. And then your first option will be to save the chat. So I recommend doing that. There's a lot of great links that were shared. We would really appreciate your feedback on this session. So I added a link to our evaluation for this session. That's the SurveyMonkey link. And just a reminder to please visit our vendor marketplace and our online auction. And if you are an AOLCP, this session and the whole conference does count for continuing education hours. So there's just email us if you need any information about how to do that. I have included some links to Laura's farm and also to our soil technical assistance page at Nofa. We do offer analysis on your Logan Labs report, which you can get from Laura. It's $25 for members and I think $50, Laura, for non-members.
That's right.
Yep. So hopefully you've learned today everything you need to know to do it yourself. But if you still need help, Laura can do that for you.
Enjoy the conference.
Thank you.
All right. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye.